Hi everyone! Nowadays, there are a lot of Irish descendants in the United States, since there was the Irish immigration in the past, which was important to the United States. So, today, our group would like to explore the Irish immigration to the United States from the 16th century through the 20th century. Let's get started. Approximately around 9.7% of American populations are Irish Americans, whose ancestors were Irish and came from Ireland. This group of people can also be called Hiberno-Americans. In the 17th century, most of Irish people were from Ulster, Ireland, while some of them were from Connacht, Leinster, and Munster. There were not a lot of Irish immigrants in the 13 colonies. At that time, most male Irish immigrants were Catholics, who became indentured servants. Most of the Irish immigration were male. Also, there were a lot of prisoners of the war who were Catholic and immigrated to the United States in Chesapeake colonies. The cost of the passage across the Atlantic Ocean was pricey. It cost the indentured servants. And a lot of people immigrated to other places and colonies. However, free exercise of Catholic was restricted by the law of Colony of Virginia in the colonial era. On the other hand, the freedom of religion was supported by the law of General Assembly of Maryland, which led to the creation of Maryland Toleration Act. At that time, the indentured servants has faced the pandemic, which caused the death to a lot of servants. Most of them were not able to survive the disease and died before finishing their contracts. The 5 Catholic churches were located in Maryland in 1650. At that time, Christian getting married with non-Christian was not usual. The intermarriage between Catholic and Protestant was insulted, and children who born by those would be raised as Catholic. Then there was the revocation of Catholic suffrage in Maryland, New York, Virginia, Rhode Island, and Carolina, due to the Glorious Revolution in 1688 to 1689. Also, the law about limiting Irish Catholic indentured servants' immigration was established. However, there was the restoration of the suffrage in Maryland in 1702. The Irish immigration to 13 colonies was changed from mostly Catholic to mostly Protestant later in the 18th century. Most of the Irish Protestant immigration immigrated with their families. This Irish Protestant immigration was the descendants of the Scottish who settled down in the plantation of Ireland, especially in Ulster. This group of people were called Ulster Scots and Anglo-Irish in Ireland, and those Protestants were called Ulster Protestants. In that period, the intermarriage between Catholic and Protestants was prohibited due to the penal laws, which the children born by this intermarriage would not be able to inherit the property from their parents legally due to the English law. Anyway, the Irish Catholics refused to convert to Protestants. That's why the intermarriage between Catholics and Protestants have not been common in Ireland since back then to the early 20th century. In Maryland, the Jesuits from baptizing the children was prohibited in 1704. Then, in 1707, the law was changed Also, the tax on passage of Irish Catholic indentured servants was collected. Around 250,000 Irish immigrants immigrated to the 13 colonies in 1717 to 1775. The beginning and during American Revolution War, in 1775, the indentured servants was composed by few colonial labor force. However, at the end of the war, there were around 24,000 to 25,000 Catholics left in the United States, and none of them were from Ireland. The Irish Catholic was failed to spread at that time. In 1790, the Irish births in America were more than 10% of the population in America, while the native Irish heritage were about 2% of American population. Moreover, the number of Catholic populations had increased since there were more Irish Catholic immigrated to the United States during the 1790s. In the 18th century, the intermarriage became more common. A lot of Irish Catholics who came to the United States decided to convert to Methodist and Baptist churches. Around 100,000 of people from Ulster immigrated to the United States in the end of the American Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. Also, the need of agricultural product was increased for the British soldiers in the French Revolutionary Wars, which led to the 22-year economic expansion in Ireland. However, there was the international economic depression, which also affected Ireland as well. More Ulster immigrants came to the United States in 1815 to 1845. Around 1 million Irish immigrants immigrated in 1820 to 1845. During the Louisiana Purchase, the Catholic population in America has increased a lot. In the late 1845, the Great Famine occurred in Ireland in 1846 to 1851, which people had faced the mad disease and starvation in Ireland. More than 1 million of Irish people immigrated to the United States, and around 90% of those Irish immigrants were Catholic. A lot of those famine immigrants in New York passed away because of the disease due to the famine. At that time, the Catholic in the United States had grown up, and the intermarriage between them became more common in the United States. The word Scotch-Irish was confusing for historians to define. On the other hand, the Irish Protestant immigration were known as Anglo-Irish, and the term Scotch-Irish was used for the Ulster Scots immigration to the United States during the 18th century. Anyway, these words were not commonly used since the Ulster Protestants recognized themselves as Irish. Then they changed and recognized themselves as the Scotch-Irish, while some of them still remain calling themselves as Irish. When the time went by, some of them identified themselves as American ancestry. The Scots-Irish stayed in eastern United States and became the cultural group. The descendants became the vanguard of the movement from Virginia to Kentucky and Tennessee. Then, the descendants of the Scotch-Irish and the identification of Ireland were lost. The Irish immigrations had influenced the American culture, especially American folk songs, through the 20th century. At the same time, the Irish Catholic in the South mostly existed in Savannah, New Orleans, and Charleston. Also, the Irish Catholic became more leaders in Democratic Party organizations and against to end slavery. Some of those Irish Catholic joined the Confederate States Army of America. The Irish Catholic in the South were accepted by the Americans. In the mid-19th century, there were around 3.3 to 3.7 million of Irish immigration in the United States. Moreover, more of Irish Ulster Protestants left Ireland and came to the United States. Due to the Great Famine, a lot of Irish from Connacht and Munster immigrated more, and so did the Irish from Ulster. The number of Catholic populations in the United States had increased a lot at that time. At the same time, there were the immigrations of the Germans, and lots of immigrations were from Poland, Canada, and Italy. However, the Irish immigration from Ulster in the United States had decreased in 1925 to 1930. Anyway, in 1930 to 1975, or during the Immigration Act of 1924 and the Great Depression, led more Irish immigrations in the United States. Then, the economy in the United States had improved a lot after the World War II. In the early 1970s, most of Irish Americans recognized themselves as being Protestant, while the majority of Irish immigrants in the 1830s identified themselves as Catholic. In the 20th century, the Irish American had more fertility rate than the population of the United States. It was because the famine in Ireland made a lot of Irish who came from rural to immigrate to the urban areas of the United States, since there was the cost to immigrate to the rural area. When it was about to turn to 20th century, there was the Irish economic growth. Therefore, the majority of people began to immigrate to Ireland in 1990s. In the 1830s, there was the need of unskilled laborers for the canal building. And because of that, there was a project called Erie Canal, a canal that made by Irish laborers. In the 1820 to 1860, there were a lot of Irish immigration after the Great Irish Famine. Furthermore, those immigrants were mostly illiterate and unskilled. Also, in 1820 to 1860, lots of Irish immigrants could not survive the disease and died when they were across the ocean. This event was known as the coffin ships. The majority of Irish immigration in this era preferred to settle in big cities to create their own communities to support each other. New York, Boston, and Philadelphia were the popular cities which contains the large number of Irish immigration. Meanwhile, many Irish immigration settled near cities and were the part of westward expansion. Those Irish immigration were convinced by the tales of gold, and they hoped to get opportunities in their work. Then, Kansas Territory was opened by the government for the settler in 1854. However, there were a lot of people took advantages from the unsettled land. The Irish immigration had played an important role in the society in that period. At that time, there was the need of physically strong laborers to build a city in Kansas City. The majority of Irish immigrants included strong male laborers. Therefore, the Kansas City was one of the cities that was built by Irish immigrations. In other words, the Irish immigrants were part of the civilization in Kansas City and many cities in the United States. Also, the majority of population in the United States today is Irish descent. Furthermore, the railroad's expansion was one of the reasons for the Irish to immigrate to the United States. Since the railways required strong laborers to build. So, railway was one of the popular occupations for the Irish immigrants. Most of Irish laborers in railways decided to settle in places they worked, which they left Irish cultures in the places they stayed, and those cultures still exist today. During the war, the Irish were against the conscription for the war. In 1863, the conscription law was passed in the war, which led to the riots in New York. The Irish decided to fight for themselves in the new country. There was the need for the rights of Irish to vote in local elections since they believed that they should be considered as citizens. During the American Civil War and the early 20th century, the Irish Americans joined the Union Army. Around more than 144,000 of Union soldiers were Irish and Irish descent. The general of the Confederate States Army in the Civil War, named John McCausland, was also the son of Irish immigrants. At that time, most of the Irish people worked as laborers, so they did not earn a lot of money. They could not afford the commutation fee for the service. The Irish believed that the African American should be seen as the competition for the jobs and the economic competitors. Some African Americans were beaten to death in the mob. Therefore, there was the Colored Orphan Asylum on Fifth Avenue, created to give shelter for children who were assaulted by the mob. This was considered as the symbol of white charity to the blacks. The Irish American continued helping mob as they saw the African American as their competitors. Luckily, the Irish American police officers were able to help the children escape the mob. For the Confederacy, many Irish people hesitated to support the secession, and a large number of Irish voted for Stephen Douglas during the election in the United States in 1860. At the same time, many male Irish Americans joined the Confederate Army. In the Reconstruction era, The Irish Americans were the important position of white supremacy and attacked the African American in New Orleans and Memphis. Then there was the Orange Riots in New York. Since the Irish Protestants celebrated the victory of Britain in the Battle of the Boyne, those Irish Protestants had a parade in the Catholic neighborhoods and insulted them. That action caused the violence between them. The police tried to stop the chaos. Unfortunately, they had to open the fire that killed around 63 of Catholic, since the Catholic decided to attack first. The Britain and Canada supporting the Confederacy in the Civil War made the United States upset. So, the relationship between the United States and Britain was not so good in the 1860s. Then, there was the secret political organization called Fenian, founded by the Irish Republican Brotherhood, or IRB. They aimed to get the independence for the Irish. They usually took place in the United States, Ireland, British, and Canada. Sometimes the Fenian was violent, as they even tried to invade Canada, but it was not successful. Also, there was the Irish Catholic politician who strongly supported the independence for Irish. And there was the famous phrase, to go against Britain. The phrase was, twisting the lion's tail. The result of post-famine Irish immigration had affected the rural economy, which convinced more high-paying jobs in the United States from 1855 to 1921. Then there was the Emergency Immigration Acts of 1921 and 1924, which limited the number of immigrants. After that, most immigrants stay in the industrial cities in Northeast and Midwest in the Irish American neighborhood. The Irish immigration to the United States had important role, which impact the society in the United States since the past until today. Nowadays, there was the large number of Irish American communities who are the Irish descendants in the United States. Besides, the female Irish settled in many towns in the United States. In the past, there was the huge Irish immigration in anthracite coal region in the Pennsylvania. Working in the factories could be seen as the best occupational opportunity for unskilled Irish men and women in that period. However, the number of Irish immigration had decreased in the United States since the mid-1900s. There were only 68,151 Irish immigration who came to the United States in order to find jobs and opportunities in their lives.
샛별 Nowadays, there are still some Irish immigrants living in the United States, as shown in the next video.
I'm here in Scituate, Massachusetts, home to the largest Irish population in the U.S. Here in Scituate, you'll find a tight-knit community, several pubs, and a picturesque view. But what may not be so obvious is the many challenges the Irish faced before getting to this point. From 1820 to 1860, over 1 million Irish migrated to the U.S. from Ireland during what's known as the Great Irish Famine, in which over 1 million people either starved to death or fell ill. Those who did manage to survive settled in Boston, New York, and several other cities like Scituate. I spoke with some residents in Scituate whose ancestors were impacted by the famine and whose ancestors endured trouble while settling in the U.S.
My grandfather in his late teens was given one of the family cows, and they said, go down to the port. You know, you'd be better off if you use this to somehow get passage to the United States. So he did that, and he came to the States, and that's the farm is still there. I visited the family farm, but that was his start.
My great-grandparents came over. One of them was a maitre d' at Jacob Worth in Boston, which is the second oldest restaurant in Boston, and that was his career for his life. And then my grandfather was a milkman, so they kind of struggled by with some pretty basic jobs.
Jobs weren't the only hardship Irish immigrants had to face. There was a political party known as the Know Nothing Party. It was founded in the mid-1850s and mostly active in Massachusetts and New York. An article published in the Daily Dispatch on April 3, 1854, says one of the organs of the Know Nothing Party in the city of New York attacks the Irish population of that city with a degree of ferocity rarely seen equaled and which bode no good for the future peace and quiet of New York. The Ku Klux Klan, infamous for lynching and torturing blacks and Jews, also tormented Irish Catholics. I spoke with some Scituate residents who were outraged by the things their ancestors had to endure.
Yeah, the Irish community faced a lot of challenges. They immigrated in through Boston, through New York, and were discriminated against quite heavily, probably up until the mid-20th century.
It's not fair. That's all I'll say about that. Not fair.
I feel as though that's unfortunate that any immigrant, including the Irish, are treated like that, but I feel as though it's great that we have the Irish Heritage Day, specifically on St. Patrick's Day, to be able to celebrate everything that they have overcome to be where we are today.
I think the issue goes beyond Irish, goes beyond religion, goes beyond ethnicity and race, and I think we spend too much time focusing on what's different about us, and rather than what we share in common. You know, we're all human beings, and, you know, when you go back far enough, none of us are Irish, right? You know, we all come from the same place.
Many Scituate residents share Kimmett's view, and although the Irish have endured many obstacles, they refuse to let that get in the way of being proud and celebrating their heritage.
Of course, there's challenges every day. Obviously, moving from a different country, coming to the one that you becomes home, you know. But I love it, you know. I came here, and you kind of take what you get and go with it from there.
I think the Irish have come a long way with all the hardships they went through. Now we had President Kennedy was an Irishman. A lot of politicians in this area are Irish. I think it's great to be Irish.
And Scituate, Massachusetts, Ashley Banks, RT.
In the American history, 468,400 Irish came to America from 1720 to 1820. Between 1820 and 1860, there were 1,956,557 Irish immigrants, 75% of whom came during the period of the Great Hunger. They were employed in mills, mines, laying or excavating parts that helped to create America, and help protect it by filling its army ranks from the numerous regiments of the Irish Union Army and the famous Irish Brigade itself. Irish immigrant women were often employed as domestic workers or in mills. They faced native prejudice together and struggled to embrace it while contributing to America's formation. The first Irish immigrant who is famous in the American history is Commander John Barry. Commander John Barry was born in Ireland in 1745 at Tecumseh, Wexford. He grew up with a strong desire to sail, and as a young man, he went to the Crown colonies in America. By 1760, he was working at a shipbuilding company in Philadelphia, and at the age of 20, he set out as captain of Barbados. In addition to directing the Continental Congress naval activities, Barry oversaw the construction of their ships. Barry seized 4 keys British warships while commanding one of those ships in 1781. When Washington was once again in need, away from the sea, Barry also participated in the 1787 Federal Convention to establish the new Constitution. During the convention, a tiny faction opposed to the approval of the new Constitution abstained from the proceedings, preventing a quorum from being established. Barry from the compellers and physically coerced enough of the dissenting members to establish a quorum. The Constitution was ultimately adopted after a vote. Overall, Barry aided in shaping America's political and naval growth. Joe Biden is the second most renowned Irish immigrant in American history. He is the 46th and current President of the United States and an American-Irish politician. He was born and raised in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and later in New Castle County, Delaware. Biden studied at the University of Delaware before earning his law degree from Syracuse University in 1968. He was elected to the New Castle County Council in 1970 and became the 6th youngest senator in the United States when he was elected to the United States Senate from Delaware in 1972 at the age 29. In the 2020 presidential election, Biden and his running partner Kamala Harris beat incumbent President Donald Trump and Vice President Mike Pence. He is the oldest president ever elected, and he is the first to have a female vice president. His early presidential activities focused on drafting, advocating for, and signing into law the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021. Also, he ordered a series of executive orders to hasten the United States recovery from the COVID-19 epidemic and the continuing recession. Biden's directives addressed the epidemic and reversed numerous Trump administration actions, including rejoining the Paris Agreement on climate change and restoring safeguards for deferred action for childhood arrivals or
DACA beneficiaries. Biden stated in April 2021 that all United States forces will leave Afghanistan by September 2021. The Irish people have been on the receiving end of many racial stereotypes when they migrated to America because the lack of jobs, poor living conditions, and many other reasons. They were treated as the lowest member of the social class. They were given jobs that were thought to be too unsafe for blacks to carry out because the loss of a slave was an out-of-pocket expense. When Irish families immigrated to the United States because there were no jobs in Ireland, they found much of the some conditions that made them think it would be a good reason to move to America. Irish were not thought to be good to have in a neighborhood because they were not familiar with plumbing. So they were forced to live in makeshift shanty towns with other Irish immigrants. When they went to find employment, the circumstances were much the same as well. The jobs that required skilled labor were not available to the Irish because they couldn't be trusted. So they mainly got jobs doing manual unskilled labor, such as working at the docks, where the risk of an injury was high. In Boston, Massachusetts, the center of anti-Irish feelings, 295 Irish immigrants were actually sent back to Britain by the Know Nothing Party for being a drain on the local economy. And in the South, some Irish were called niggers, turned inside out, while black slaves were called smoke Irish. This shows that the Irish were not held very high in the eyes of Americans. Another reason the Irish were labeled as outcasts is because of their religion. At this point in history, America was made up of mostly Protestants. However, the majority of the Irish immigrants were Catholic. Most Irish children were put into parochial schools, and religion was placed as a big priority in their lives. The Irish held on tightly to their religious ways, a main reason being that was the one thing that still tied them to their homeland. Americans refused to accept Catholic due to the differences in their beliefs and practice. Today, Catholicism is one of the United States' most common religions, which much thanks due to the Irish migration. Lastly, drinking was a big part of Irish culture. Americans feared their mostly Protestant nation would soon die out if the mostly Catholic Irish all migrated to the United States. Another reason why the Irish were not treated fairly. Not only were the Irish viewed as hot-headed, violent people with strange religious views, they were also known to be unskilled and drunk. Americans view Irish as alcoholics due to the drinking that is weaved into their culture and ways of living. Much like our culture does today, Irish drank in several different social settings. Although they did drink alcohol at someone's wake before the funeral, which may have been what disgusted Americans the most. Americans saw alcohol so ruling over the Irish, and they were merry slaves. Up to today, the Irish were known to be drunks before of the drinking that is associated with their culture. In America, with the introduction of the Hibernian Chronicle 1810 to today's publications, the Irish newspaper have a long history here. The Irish media's goal overseas is the narrative of Irish migration and the lives of people who have left Ireland over the past 150 years. The diaspora in Ireland has established a distinct Irish culture. There are so many times across the globe while 5 million people dwell in these islands. Some 70 million individuals in every part of the world claim Irish ancestry, either born in Ireland or have been able to trace their roots for centuries, and 40 million of them reside in the United States. Boston is known for its Irishness for many years, and the Boston Irish Reporter has been in the news since 1990. This monthly magazine has 60,000 readers and reports on the Irish American community's tales and activities. The Irish Echo. It is an America's oldest Irish journal. The Weekly Echo has been a testimonial to the gradual development of the Irish community towards middle-class America, reporting news to the freshly arriving and resettled communities of Irish migrations since 1928. Also, the Irish Voice. It is a new arrival in New York avenues. This issue was immediately turned into a campaign issue by the new magazine, which was founded in 1987 during a massive influx of illegal Irish migrations to the United States of America.
The population of Ireland reached a peak around 1841, a level it has still to match. Famine and mass emigration led to a rapid fall from 1845 onwards. The 1841 census showed that there were almost 8.2 million people living in the 4 provinces of Connacht, Leinster, Munster, and Ulster. Only 40 years later, at the 1881 census, this figure had fallen by over 3 million to just over 5 million. This equated to 37% fewer people than there had been. This figure, however, continued to fall to a recorded historical low of 4.2 million for the whole island by 1926. The famine had a far-reaching effect on Ireland's population. Through the 1830s and 1840s, the rural population of Ireland had become very dependent on the potato as a staple part of the diet. Over-dependent, in fact. The price to pay for this dependence was the famine, of which became known as Black 47. The famine was partly caused by potato blight, which was caused by a fungus. This fungus was not new at this time. It had caused the loss of crops before the 1840s with some regularity. In 1830–31 particularly bad outbreaks of potato blight had led to localized hardships in some parts of Ireland, and reduced a good many families to begging to stay alive. What was particularly bad and ultimately tragic about the outbreak was that it wasn't simply one poor season for potatoes, but a series of poor seasons that had begun in 1845 when a third to a half of the potato harvest was lost. This was followed by an almost total loss of the potato crop in 1846. The potatoes grown in Ireland at the time and eaten by the poor were almost exclusively a variety called the Irish lumper. It was particularly susceptible to potato blight. Potatoes were the staple diet in rural Ireland and provided 60% of Irish food needs. Hence, the famine killed nearly 1/8 of the entire population due to starvation and the epidemic disease that resulted from it. Another, and more significant factor as to why the famine was particularly devastating, was that of the inactions and actions of the Whigs, Liberals, of the British government in London, led by Lord John Russell, were severely worsening the famine. The general view in Westminster was that the Irish were not worth their effort and the famine was the fault of the Irish. Rather than treating the famine as an imperial responsibility, they thrust the responsibility to Ireland despite them having inadequate resources and infrastructure to deal with the problems on hand. For example, England alone had over 6,500 miles of railway while Ireland only had little over 150 miles of track. With food prices rising, the British government did not increase workers' wages. The Irish people found it increasingly difficult to afford food. They even imposed tariffs on food, meaning it would be more expensive. The government decreed that no surplus food was to be given to the starving, as not to disturb the food industry. Whilst the British government established a soup kitchen in March of 1847, they quickly discontinued this by that September, because they believed the food shortage would end within the year. Therefore, they only implemented temporary relief measures. The soup kitchen was feeding 3 million people daily, but the British government thought that running it wasn't worth the effort. The British implementation of free trade meant that all Irish crops were sold, leaving the farmer nothing to eat. The crippled economy and free trade meant farmers had no money to pay rent. British Foreign Minister, Lord Palmerston, instantly evicted all farmers who were unable to pay. Absentee landlords were common in Ireland, and for many of them, the primary focus was income rather than the conditions of their tenants. Many of these landowners realized that they could get a higher income by turning their properties to pasture rather than to continue with the old practice of collecting rents from tenant farmers. Eviction was the most common way of getting rid of unwanted tenants. The tenant frequently built their cottage themselves, from local materials. However, their rent was higher if they had windows, if their door was over a certain height, or if they made any type of improvements or enlargements to the dwelling. Landlords practiced what was known as rack renting, in order to get rid of tenants. Rents were raised to the point that the tenant could not afford to pay them, but they then had the tenant evicted for non-payment of rent. There were no appeals and no mercy shown. Although the only legal reason for eviction was non-payment of the rent, there were numerous examples of landlords who evicted tenants if they did not conform to their wishes. A particularly tragic aspect of the famine was that despite the failure of the main crop that should have provided the staple diet for over a third of the population, generally the poorest third, Ireland did successfully produce a good crop of grain in 1847. This grain, however, was owned in the main by absent landlords and was exported for cash while many of Ireland's own people were starving. Despite the over-reliance on potatoes, grain was unaffected by the potato blight, and this could have averted the worst effects of the famine, had this grain been used at home to feed the people. The poor were often reduced to looking through the ravaged potato fields for any potatoes that had escaped the disease. Ireland and her people were neglected by the central government in Westminster. Irish racism in Victorian Britain included the stereotyping of the Irish as violent and alcoholic. Some English illustrators depicted a prehistoric ape-like image of Irish faces to bolster evolutionary racist claims that the Irish people were an inferior race as compared to Anglo-Saxons. Similar to other immigrant populations, they were sometimes accused of cronyism and subjected to misrepresentations of their religious and cultural beliefs. Irish Catholics were particularly singled out for attack by Protestants. In Liverpool, England, where many Irish immigrants settled following the Great Famine, anti-Irish prejudice was widespread. The sheer numbers of people coming across the Irish Sea and settling in the poorer districts of the city led to physical attacks, and it became common practice for those with Irish accents or even Irish names to be barred from jobs, public houses and employment opportunities. There were even signs in the pubs saying, "No blacks, no dogs, no Irish." There were also Nina signs, reading, "Help wanted, no Irish need apply." In 1836, young Benjamin Disraeli wrote, "The Irish hate our order, our civilization, our enterprising industry, our pure religion. This wild, reckless, indolent, uncertain and superstitious race have no sympathy with the English character. Their ideal of human felicity is an alternation of clannish broils and coarse idolatry. Their history describes an unbroken circle of bigotry and blood." Desperate as the months went on, and for those who could, emigration was their only hope. Emigration had always been an aspect of Irish life, but the famine hastened the flow enormously. The option of leaving one's country was not an easy way out by any means. As well as the usual worries and problems of leaving home and going to a new foreign country, there were additional difficulties of a lack of funds to pay for the trip and also a lack of money for provisions. The fares were around 55 shillings to Canada, and 70 to 100 shillings to the USA. 20 shillings equaled £1. Travel on board the ship was either in standard class or steerage. Standard class included berths and the passengers could walk on the decks, small though they were. Steerage passengers were treated more like livestock. They were crowded together below decks, often not being allowed to use the deck. For the majority of emigrants, steerage was the most they could afford. Many people who left Ireland by ship for the United States in particular never arrived, dying of starvation or related disease en route. Disease that was made worse by the cramped and unsanitary conditions on the ships. Some of the ships that left Ireland during these famine years were known as coffin ships for good reason. On some ships up to 40% of passengers died during the voyage or shortly after arrival. Overall, about 1 in 7 did not survive the crossing. Before the famine, the rate of emigration in 1845 was at around 50,000 per year. The next year, 1846, as the famine started to hit hard, 100,000 left. The peak was in 1847, the hardest famine year, when 250,000 left. It continued at an average of around 200,000 per year for the next 5 years, before beginning to fall again. Little over 150 years after the famine, Ireland's population has still not recovered. In 1845 there were over 8 million people on the island. As of January 2018, the population of Ireland was just under 5 million people.
And that's all for today. Thank you for listening. Hope you have a good day. Bye.